Who would like to start? Katrina, please.
Garamagwив agus Garamagwив and Birchigov Vishishin Always. That was very concise presentations, and thank you for that. What you mentioned about the Irish Constitution and then obviously European and international law, I think it might be useful if our experts could outline where Ireland is in breach of our EU and international obligations in terms of economic and social rights.
Okay, thank you. Other comments or questions? Okay, well, it's nothing, nobody asking. Which of you would like to deal with that question?
I think I'm going to just now in terms of thanks for the question, Katrina. The monitoring mechanisms in place, the most recent report is from the European Committee on Social Rights. Their report from just a few weeks ago or a few months ago covered the period of 2008 to 2011. They said that Ireland, well, first of all, Ireland did not provide a lot of information on how it was meeting its obligations in certain areas, in particular the employment law areas, minimum conditions of employment, health and safety. They stated that payments for job seekers, persons with disability, etc., were adequate. They said that Ireland is meeting obligations on, as regards obligations to protect against poverty. However, they went on to say that state level of benefits for social security, that's where you make contributions. So, when you pay your stamp that they were not adequate. So where you have made contributions, you're then, suffer an accident at work, you are made redundant, the level of payment that you receive, according to the European Committee on Social Rights, is not adequate. They also said that there was a failure to supervise the delivery of services to vulnerable people, in particular the elderly and disabled, by private operators. That state had kind of passed on in its duty, passed on a lot of its duties to private operators, which wasn't a problem, but failing to supervise them. And also it requested further information. It couldn't actually see whether Ireland was ensuring protection of rights for the elderly under the European Social Charter. That's from just a few weeks ago, but that covers the period from 2008 to 2011. So it is looking back, and it is 2 years out of, even though they just reported in December, it is an assessment that's 2 years out of date. The Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights reported in 2003. I don't think that's a lifetime away, given what has happened. But they did similar topics and some issues come up. Persistence of poverty, still an issue. Discrimination against members of the travelling community. Inadequacy of welfare payment levels, they ascertained in 2003. We are reporting to this body next year. It will be interesting to see what they say. And also the lack of a human rights-based approach to anti-poverty mechanisms. That was another, but that's from 2003. So how useful that can be now 11 years down the line, but we're reporting to that committee this year, and it'll be interesting to see whether we are meeting our obligations under the international treaties. Sorry for going on slightly with that.
Thanks very much, Liam. Maureen has a question up here. Could we have the mic over here, please? Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. I know the decision was to look at economic, social and cultural rights today, and there were other submissions, but particularly there were quite a lot on environmental rights. And my question is, could environmental rights conceivably be considered under economic, social and culture as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to take that?
Sorry, this is on? Yeah. There's obviously a very strong connection between, say, rights around, say, health or, to health and issues around the environment, for instance. And there are strong connections between economic and social and cultural rights and environmental rights. But generally, if you see how constitutions treat them, normally environmental rights are in another in another provision. They're not generally dealt with together. And part of the reason for this is because environmental rights are regarded as raising enough of their own issues, in fact, to really merit their own provision or their own section, which is one of the reasons that obviously some of the things you talk about today would connect with issues around the environment, but to kind of try to shoehorn environmental rights into the provisions on economic, social and cultural rights isn't something that's generally been done just because it's felt that they deserve their own focus.
And just one brief point in relation to EU law, I referred to the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and it should be noted that one of the provisions of the Charter recognises the principle of protection of the environment. But again, it's distinct from economic and social and cultural rights as we traditionally understand them.
Thank you. Catherine, please.
Thank you very much for sterling gold-plated presentations, really. And just a question I have then is, at this point, is that if we are to ultimately decide that the economic, social and cultural rights should be incorporated in some way more into our constitution, first of all, clearly I think that means that therefore we would be agreeing that courts should be able to protect those rights, or individual citizens have access to courts to do that. But would it also be our declaration that any government or Oireachtas must, not should, effectively proof its laws according to economic, social and cultural rights, according to both our international obligations, our constitutional obligations, obviously then, but also the European obligations?
Thank you. Well, a very good question.
Senator Zappone, you're absolutely right. The government has an international obligation, as it is, to ensure that laws are proofed, poverty-proofed, gender-proofed, to ensure that it meets economic, has international obligations, which it is arguable it does not meet. And then access to courts, I absolutely agree that is a fundamental issue. In terms of tribunal, I did examine the figures last night as regards access to tribunal, social, if you were laid off or if you are caring for an elderly relative, you must apply for a payment. If you're refused, you may have to go before the Social Welfare Appeals Office, and the delays in that office are, for some cases, over 12 months plus. So effective access to courts and remedies is something that is absolutely essential. And our own courts often look at economic, social, cultural rights. Most recently, because of the European Convention on Human Rights Act, the Irish High Court looks at economic, social, cultural rights, because there is no clear distinction between what says your right to private family life and what is your, and what is a violation of your right to social security or an adequate standard of living.
And I think just in relation to the Constitution, obviously if it was for a part of the Constitution, not like the current Article 45, which is not cognisable by the courts, but a part of the Constitution which could be enforced by the courts, of course the government and the Oireachtas would have to proof their laws in order to ensure the constitutionality, just as they do with respect to any other provisions of the Constitution.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, sorry, David. Didn't see you.
My name is David Cullinan. Liam, you're right that the UN Committee on ESC Rights published its report in 2002, which you could argue is somewhat dated. We're 14 years on. But one of the main recommendations of that report, in my understanding, was that it recommended that we should look at or should consider putting ESC rights on a constitutional as well as a legislative footing. We also had the 2012 Universal Periodic Review of Ireland's Human Rights, which also made a similar recommendation. So while the report itself might be dated, I think it's important for us to understand what were the clear recommendations that those findings made, and have we since then implemented those. But the core one of obviously putting ESC rights in the constitutional footing has not happened, or we wouldn't be having this discussion today.
You're absolutely right, and that was a bit of an omission on my part. The very first recommendation of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights was constitutional protection of economic, social, cultural rights. The reason they recommend that is that the kind of whims of, can I say that? The whims of public office can sometimes, blow quite coldly for those groups that may not have access to, numerically have access to the political system. So the main recommendations, and another recommendation, the Universal Periodic Review, and also recommendations that has since followed in the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, have all emphasised the need for kind of strong or strongly anchored protection of economic, social, cultural rights, constitutional mechanisms being the strongest anchor you can give to recognise the need to protect economic, social, cultural rights of vulnerable groups, in particular vulnerable groups who may not have, because of their numbers, may not have access to the political system or may not be able to influence the political system.
Okay. Yeah, maybe this will be the last question in this session. So,
Hi, Sheila Canavan. I'm just wondering what the panel might consider to be the best institution to establish the balance of the common good in this whole context.
Okay, thanks, Sheila.
Well, Sheila, that's a really tricky question. And I think the answer to it might be that there's no single institution that can best protect these rights, and that there's a role for, of course, there's a role for the Parliament, extremely important role, primary role for the Parliament and for the government, but there may also be a role for the courts, just as there is a role for the courts in enforcing and vindicating many of our other constitutional rights, if we're to put these in the Constitution itself. But the exact balance between the two is a really difficult issue, which I think it's important for you to consider in your deliberations today, because there are different models around the world, and in Aoife's presentation we'll hear about some of those models. But I think the short answer is that it's not any one single institution that should determine the common good. It's something that has to be understood in the context of the Constitution as a whole.